Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of the Overcoming Chronic Illness podcast. My name is Dr. Brian Rade, and I'm a naturopathic doctor. And I am joined today by Dr. Bruce Hoffman. Dr. Hoffman runs the Hoffman Center for Integrative and Functional Medicine in beautiful Alberta, Canada. I believe they're based out of Calgary, which is a city in Alberta, Canada, for any non-Canadians who might not know that. And I've been looking forward to talking with Dr. Hoffman for a few weeks now. If you've listened to other episodes of the podcast, you may have heard the interview I had a few weeks ago. Geez, where's the time go? I don't know, 6 to 8 weeks ago, sometime around the summer or fall of 2023, with a nutritionist named Justine Stenger. Justine is works at the Hoffman Center for Integrative and Functional Medicine, and we had a great chat about a number of different topics, but primarily revolving around the use of certain phospholipids for treating different issues. So we had a great conversation, and then we were chatting about Dr. Hoffman's some of his Justine mentioned how he has certain approaches that are really quite inspirational and great, and I asked her to elaborate on that, and she said, you should really just talk to Dr. Hoffman, and you're straight from the horse's mouth. Fortunately, Dr. Hoffman was generous enough to take some of his time to chat with me today, and so I am looking forward to picking his brain about the phospholipid therapy, just to see what kind of experience he's had in practice. My understanding is he also recommends neurofeedback for his patients, which is something that we've been doing at our clinic for the last little while. So I'm looking forward to talking to him about that, and just to see what his overall philosophy is with treating folks dealing with complex chronic illness. So I think it'll be a great chat, and I hope that it will be of interest to you folks listening as well. So I am just going to pause the recording for a second, and I'll rejoin with Dr. Hoffman in just a moment. All right, everyone. So I'm back now with Dr. Hoffman. Dr. Hoffman, thanks so much for joining me today.
Hi. Pleased to meet you, Brian.
Nice to meet you too. So Dr. Hoffman, I've got a bunch of questions for you. But before we get into the questions, would you mind just telling listeners how you got involved working with folks dealing with complex chronic illness?
It was a gradual evolution over time, working, starting out in family practice, and then gradually, as one accumulates more education and more experience, you find yourself gravitating to those areas that inspire you and which you can be of the most benefit to people. And it's so cool. It appears that now I deal with people with multi-system, multi-symptom systems biology issues, which is very different from what we learned at med school, as you're aware, which is silo-based individual organ, individual treatment. It's a very different paradigm, and they have almost very little in common, which is, as you know, I mean, they have a lot in common because there's underlying pathogenesis, but in terms of really understanding and helping people, if you're not thinking in sort of high level systems biology, you can't really, and also take into account the interior psychology of the individual and the family systems that they came from and the environmental exposures they have and the multiple potential problems that may be impinging on their physical bodies. You can't really help orientate them to the therapeutic process. So it's a very different paradigm from what we learned at med school or naturopathic college, as you're aware. So I just graduated to it as my education expanded and my knowledge base expanded and my client base expanded over the decades, really. I calculated I've done over approaching 300 conferences since 2000, just on, as you do, learning different insights to autism and Lyme and mold and mast cell, et cetera, et cetera.
Wow, yeah, 300 is impressive, to say the least. I think you got me beat there, and I pride myself on my continuing education addiction. So that's impressive.
When you're inspired, that's what you do. It's just you just get up and go to conferences. Or now with Zoom, it's great, but
It's true. Yeah.
going back to you have to go in person again, which is much to my horror. I like doing it on Zoom.
Me too. Yeah, it doesn't take me away from my family as much, and it saves on the hotel bills. And yeah, it's less radiation exposure on airplanes. There's lots of good benefits to the online. Yeah. Well, I'd like to pick your brain a bit, Dr. Hoffman, about the kind of the approach that you use. As I believe you No, I spoke with one of your colleagues, Justine, several weeks ago, and she kind of put us in touch. So I'm thankful to her for that. And she mentioned, and I'm sorry, I'm blanking on the exact terminology, but I think she said that there's like a certain number of like pillars or levels, or you have like kind of a
Yeah,
system that you work within. So I'd like to ask you about that. And just
yeah.
before you get into that, I just want to remind listeners that nothing that we're saying today should be construed as medical advice. This is all for informational purposes only. If you need medical advice, please talk to your healthcare provider to get that advice. But with that out of the way, Dr. Hoffman, would you mind speaking to the approach that you take, please?
Yeah, sure. So when people book appointments with me, my sort of internal sort of checklist is um, is subjective and objective. I want to know who the person is sitting in front of me. I also want to know objective data about them. So I use an internal checklist, which I developed over the years, called the 7-stage model to health and transformation. And it's based on an Ayurvedic model whereby the individual self is broken down into layers and levels. They call them separate bodies. And for simplicity's sakes, I use the model of the first stage is the stage of the environmental exposures. That's the earth outside of us, the air, the water, the food that we eat, and the potential for toxicity from those exposures. So that's stage one or level one. Level two is all to do with biochemistry and structure, so the physical entity. And I look at that both from a pathology point of view, using my medical training, and I look at it from a functional systems biology point of view, using functional medicine insights, the so-called model of antecedents, mediators, and triggers, as you're familiar with. And I'm using, particularly in that model, the recent um, work of Dr. Robert Naveau, who has posited the cell danger response as being underlying and underpinning many of the um, symptoms and signs of chronic complex illness, meaning that the mitochondria are the not only are the organelle in the body that transmute food or macronutrients and micronutrients to energy, but they're also the first line of cellular defense. So whenever toxic load exceeds the capacity to detoxify, the outer electrical membrane of the cell changes, the phospholipid bilayer changes. There's this cascade of inflammatory cytokines that then damage the DNA, that then goes outside the cell, that then becomes pro-inflammatory along with ATP, that then activates mast cells, that then activates further peroxynitrate, and damage continues, and this inflammatory cycle just continues unless, and Robert Naveau's greatest contribution, unless you start signaling into the mitochondrial inflammatory cycle what he calls cellulogenesis, you put into the cycle transcription factors and nutrients and any form of signaling interventions that get you out of this chronic inflammatory cycle. You can't just sit back, treat it with a drug and hope for the best. You got to remove the triggers and put into the system those systems, those molecules, those interventions, those nutraceuticals, hormones, etc., that repair the cycle and restore an individual to what is called the health cycle. The health cycle is the resilience cycle where your circadian rhythms are established, you sleep soundly, you exercise soundly, you're grounded, you're connected, and you have resilience to the slings and arrows of life, which are quite considerable these days.
Indeed.
So that's level two. And then level three is all to do with the autonomic nervous system, the brain, and the electromagnetic reality, you know. So as the work of Jack Kruse and others showing that we're electrical beings, and it's actually the electrical signaling from our DNA that then orchestrates a lot of the stage two biochemistry. And so it behooves us to be insightful as to not only our external electromagnetic exposures, but whether our own internal electromagnetic signaling is coherent or incoherent. And that's another whole discussion. But that has a lot to do also with the Porges's polyvagal dorsal collapse theory. Many people present in, they're not in coherence. They are more sympathetically driven, or they in dorsal vagal shutdown, whereby the autonomic nervous system is not able to restore health, just like the mitochondria can't be restored back to health. And those individuals will often need a lot of neurobiofeedback training, somatic experiencing, integrated body psychotherapies, external devices, red light therapies, lasers. There's a whole slew of potential therapeutic benefits that help modulate that that dorsal vagal shutdown response. So that's level 3. And then level 4 in my model is, we know that it's highly symptomatic and dysregulated. Their capacity to self-regulate is distorted. The parent is meant to be the external regulator of the emerging reptilian emotional and adult brains over 30 years as the child learns to orientate themselves emotionally and physically to the world. And if there's early developmental trauma, either neglect trauma or abuse trauma, the emerging prefrontal cortex of the child is dysregulated, and their ability to self-regulate gets severely incapacitated or dysregulated, leading to different attachment style problems and so forth and so on, personality disorders even. So I attempt to take a history of early developmental trauma. And if the person is dysregulated, and we see that through heart rate variability, we see that through QEEGs, and just taking a history, then one of the primary interventions that we do at our clinic is teaching them to self-regulate. And that is not easy. Neuroplasticity is quite a concept, and it's not done overnight,
Mm-hmm.
And so to change the way the brain is orientated to the world, and to change the default mode and network of the brain, it's a year at least of continuous practice, twice a day, continual somatic work sometimes. And now with the emerging psychedelic therapies, often we have to use those in order to short circuit the part of the brain that's habituated to the old patterns of behavior, not only to address trauma, but then to go and address spiritual yearnings. And there's a whole discussion around psychedelics, which is very exciting, and which we can talk about maybe later.
For sure.
And then level 5 is all to do with ego development and the ego development of the first half of life, and the internal dialogue and the defenses we have, the operational sense of the self. And I really want to know, when I'm sitting in front of a person, is that capacity to be resilient, resourceful, how present is it, and how resistant is it? We get many people highly intellectual, highly resistant, highly defended, and that individual is impenetrable. And you can't work with them at the lower levels because their defenses are so rigid and defended. So one has to know what defenses are there, what the internal dialogue is, and how ready they are to make changes. And one has to adjust one's own internal state to try and meet them where they are. Often, people with adverse childhood experiences project onto you any unresolved issues they have with mother and father. And then all of a sudden you're sitting with projections and resistances, and they have an intellectual need to get better, but they are psychologically defended. And unless you address that, high resistance or very fragile, capacities, you can't really intervene with biochemistry and diet and detox and all the rest of it. There's no huge resource for them to do that. So you have to help them build that capacity of resilience, which can be in and of itself a year's worth of work before you get to treat the mold and the Lyme and everything else. I'm sure you've encountered that many times.
Yep.
So that's big. The first half of life, the patients represent very different from the second half of life. People who are over 40, they have a different agenda often. They're shifting from the drives of the first half of life to the calling of we call it the inner world, the psyche, the soul. They need to know who they are. They need to call back parts of themselves they've left behind in the pursuit of the first half of life drives. And so a person who presents ill in the second half of life has a very different agenda than those in the first half of life. And I believe it behooves us to know the difference. And then that's the fifth level. The sixth level is to do with the inner cartography of the personal self, the unconscious, if you will, the shadow, the projections of the shadow, the archetypes that drive us, and the collective unconscious with collective archetypes that drive ourselves as a culture. And often we have to know the cultural background of individuals. We have to know at which stage of life people are. We have to know how much inner work they've done. We have to know what their soul wants of them. And in that level, I'm always looking at symptoms as teleological. Symptoms are pointing us in the direction where people haven't looked consciously at what they need to look at in order to achieve what we would call individuation, or knowing themselves as much as they are capable of knowing themselves. So for that work, I use a lot of Jungian psychoanalytic work. I probe the depths of alchemy as much as I can in a limited fashion. Carl Jung was a great pioneer of the objective reality of the psyche, the inner world, and he used alchemical texts to help him create some of the insights around that. And then level 7 is the so-called spiritual aspects of the self, which are non-local, nothing to do with the individual self, but placing the self in the context of a larger reality, the mystery, the mystery of where on earth did this all begin? Where is it all going to end? And of course, we have no answers for that.
Mm-hmm.
It's an existential sort of orientation to the great mysteries of life and how people navigate and negotiate themselves. Because at that reality, the evidence of our own unimportance against the background of infinity is somewhat overwhelming. So what do you do with that? You can treat your Lyme disease, but then what? So I like to sort of have all of these alive in my interaction. Of course, at different layers and levels. Everybody comes with physical stuff, so you want to do a physical history, both traditional medical and functional. Mm-hmm. But of course, the key cardinal feature of all successful outcomes is whether or not you can establish an empathic limbic resonance with the client, with the patient. If there's no trust, nothing can happen, because then you just become a talking head with a bunch of data. You say, oh, you got mold, take cholestyramine. Well, then the person doesn't trust you and they don't believe you. And there's no salience, there's no relevance, and there's no connection. That's why doing Zoom calls is difficult. Sometimes you've got to be in the biosphere of the individual to really, see them and look at them in the eyes and make eye contact. And Porges's great contribution of the polyvagal theory was the upper ventral vagus is all to do with trust and to do with the eyes and the tone of voice and the smile. And when a good mother looks at the child, that's all active. You smile
Mhm.
and there's the twinkle in the eye, the gleam in the eye. That establishes safety in the world. And if a child doesn't have that, and you don't have that as a therapist because you're a surrogate parent, the healer doctor is a very parental archetype. If that's not established in the very beginnings of a intervention, you can throw all the therapeutics at an individual, but they'll kick them out. They won't take them in. Well, that's what my belief. That's what I work with. I mean,
Mhm.
many people get well without using that complex model. So I just have a bias towards the way I work. I'm not saying it's the way. That's how I work. And I do my best. Sometimes I'm very level two, like, treat your SIBO and take your probiotic and use your rifaximin. And that's the right thing for that level. But the long-term outcomes depend on much more than that.
Sounds incredibly comprehensive, Dr. Hoffman. And I was saying to you before we started recording here that I have to leave in a little bit to go to a conference, but I feel like I'm getting some continuing education right now. I'm gonna have to put this into my regulatory college to see if I can qualify for some CE hours here, because yeah, it's a really incredibly comprehensive approach, and I really appreciate you sharing that with us. It's really fascinating.
Yeah, sure.
I have a few questions, sort of from what you said. I feel like we could. I feel like if you were to get into the details of all this, it would be like probably a month-long course to try to cover all this. And um,
Yeah, the sub. So I have a rather grandiose plan in mind. Forgive me, but
mhm,
I've titled my 7 stage to health and transformation as the new curriculum for whole person healing. I'm going to try in the rest of my living days
mhm.
to establish a curriculum so each subset and each layer gets fleshed out, into a diagnostic paradigm and a therapeutic paradigm. So it'll take me 5 lifetimes to flesh it out. So,
Well, let me know in this lifetime or a future lifetime when it's ready to go, because I'll happily head out to Alberta or do it via Zoom. Look,
yeah,
any good excuse to go to Alberta, though, I'm happy to come visit. So let me know when that course is ready to go. I'd love to
yeah,
learn from you. Um,
sure.
I had one tiny question, just because we had a little connection issue for about 5 seconds, and it was right when you said the kind of the heading for your level 4. I didn't catch it. What would you call level 4?
So it's the emotional body. Level 5 is the intellectual. Level 3 is the electromagnetic. Level 2 is physical and structural.
Okay, great.
Different bodies, different. They call them koshas in Ayurveda. I did a lot of studying in Ayurveda in India.
Mhm. Do you say koshas, or I've heard of the doshas, but am I
No,
hearing that wrong?
koshas is K. That's the bodies. Doshas is the personality profiling. Yeah.
Oh, okay, gotcha.
I work a lot with those. Doshas are
Mhm.
very important. The few sort of things I work with a lot are doshas, Myers-Briggs typology, attachment styles. I need to know those in intimate detail when I'm working with a patient, because how they present and how you work with them, you've not only got to negotiate your own biases, and you've got to know what they're presenting with so you can interact appropriately. A person with anxious attachment styles and introvert, extrovert, and Vata dosha versus Kapha, very different ways you interact with them. You can't just blanketly use the same inner state to meet them. You've got to adjust your own internal state in order to meet where they are.
Yeah, that's really, really insightful. Yeah, I've noticed that with my patients, and I've thought like it would be really fascinating to take the time to try to figure out some subtyping. But yeah, there's these pre-existing systems. Oh, sorry, what were you going to say?
I just use questionnaires and I read them before I get online, and then
Right,
I
right.
and then I just I look at Myers-Briggs,
Mhm.
INTP. I mean, an introvert is very different from an extrovert, a thinking and a feeling type. And if you don't adjust accordingly, you get into all kinds of pickles.
Fair enough.
And it's all the art of medicine. The science of medicine is beautiful. I love it. The art of medicine is another whole saga. There's a lot to it. Yeah.
100%.
Yeah.
Um, well, maybe to dip our toe back into the just more strictly science aspect of it, if you don't mind, Dr. Hoffman, because I know folks listening to the podcast are generally wondering about, you know, um, uh, you know, supplements or different treatment methods and things like that. And you're preaching to the converted with me, and I think I'm
Of
sure to
course.
much of my audience where we, the higher level work is so important, and that's something where can't just take a pill for that. As you said, it's a long process. You need to work with the right people, the right approaches and whatnot. So around the kind of getting back to level two, like the biochemical aspect of things, and I appreciate you bringing up the work of Dr. Navio, who I think is a huge asset, to big
Huge.
gift to our world and our complex chronic health issue community. But where you mentioned, putting different, and I'm paraphrasing here a bit, but putting different agents into the system to kind of interrupt the cell danger response. So, we've talked a lot on the podcast, previous episodes, about the importance of treating, and getting rid of mold and heavy metals, Lyme, co-infections. And I'd love to pick your brain about all that stuff too, but we won't have time to cover everything today.
Yeah.
But I'm just wondering if you could speak to some of the agents that you found to be, amongst the most helpful, on average. Everyone's different, of course. Everybody needs a certain protocol, but in terms of like your maybe top, 3 or 4 like heaviest hitters that you
Yeah.
see the most
Yeah.
consistently helpful, would you mind speaking to that, please?
Yeah, sure. So complex patients, you've got to get them self-regulating. So they've got to learn some practice of self-regulation. There's many techniques. That's number one. Number two, if they've got POTS, if you don't treat POTS, forget about it. You're not going to get anywhere. So then
Mm-hmm.
we address POTS. Number three, we address mast cell activation syndrome, because if you can't treat mast cell, they're going to react to everything. And I don't know what your patient load is, but I've got the patients that have 3 foods and they can't take any supplements, and they're malnourished,
Yeah.
and they dysregulated. That's my patient base, basically. So self-regulation, POTS treatment, mast cell stabilization. Then I get all the rest of the functional medicine labs, and then I look and see hierarchically where they are at in terms of their deficiencies or excesses. And then I start repairing cell membranes. And that's when I start using phospholipids and fats and oils. And 99% of my patients are very dysregulated in omega-6, omega-3, omega-9, saturated fats, plasmalogens. So the next big level of intervention, let me just step back, nutritional stabilization. Nutritional stabilization, Justine does all my nutritional work. We do first intake, and then the second is doing a chronometer and blood sugar regulation, where she assesses 8 days of diet and 14 days of blood sugar. If we don't get the macro micronutrients in the food stabilized, forget, I won't work the patient. You can't. It's impossible.
Mm-hmm.
So we do nutrition, then we do interventions, and we use phospholipids and fats and oils. We use tons of different oils, but we titrate it against the deficiencies and excesses on the lab testing. And most people come in omega-3 saturated because they're all on fish oil, and omega-6 depleted. So they all need linoleic acid and evening primrose, and many people need arachidonic acid. Everybody thinks arachidonic acid is disastrous, but it's not. If you don't have enough arachidonic acid, which we get from egg yolk, which many people can't take because they're mast cell active, then you're not going to stabilize the immune system and the prostaglandins, etc. So then it's fats, and then it's all the rest, all the nutraceuticals that we use. So most of my patients that come here go through that, and then we do intravenous mast cell stabilization. We do IV Benadryl, IV Ativan, to lower the amygdala hyperactivity, which is always accompanying mast cell activation in my world. And then we start to put on the foods and supplements so that they're not so mast cell active. So we do IV Benadryl, IV Ativan, and then put on the rest of the nutraceuticals and try and add more foods over time. And it's a long process. It's 2 steps forward, 1 step back. They're highly complex and highly reactive individuals. I don't touch them. I don't touch the Lyme disease until 6 months in. Don't go near it.
Mm-hmm.
Don't go near it.
Just because people will react, like flare up too badly, or what's the
You
reason?
can't go treating Lyme disease when your basic architecture of the basement of the individual is rotten. Not rotten, that's a horrible word. Is defective or insufficient.
There we go. That's a good
You
one.
can't. Yeah, you can't. And don't go putting people on cholestyramine when their lipid uh, content is low. When their fat content is low and you go and put cholestyramine, a binder on for mold, you just made them worse. They'll crash in front of your eyes
Hmm.
because you're absorbing their lipids, which they need for cell membrane integrity.
Right.
Yeah.
Dr. Hoffman, would you mind just circling back a bit? As I haven't had any other guests previously talk about my cell stabilization. Would you mind just fleshing that out a bit more, just explaining what's that about? And
Oh,
uh,
cell membrane medicine.
I think you said the my cell stabilization.
Oh, that's my South African accent.
Okay, is it me cell?
Mast cell,
Oh, mast
mast.
cell. Okay, my apologies. I thought you were talking about me cells. And I was like, oh, okay, that's okay. That makes a lot
People
more
always say,
sense.
"What? What?"
It's like I've never heard of me cell stabilization. Tell me more. Okay, my apologies. I've
Mast
several
cell,
South
mast.
African patients, and I love their accents. It's always it's one of the best ones out there, I think. But yeah, sorry, my apologies on that one. Okay,
Mast cell.
mast cell.
Everybody's got mast cell overactivity,
Indeed, indeed, yeah.
and it's a big problem. And I work with Dr. Afrin's group, and there's a group of us, about 300 of us, who constantly in email exchange. We call ourselves the masterminds, and so we use a lot of mast cell stabilizing. Reducing histamine foods. B, using nutraceuticals, but I use pharmaceuticals very liberally to stabilize mast cells, IV and orally. H1 blockers, H2 blockers, leukotriene inhibitors, cromolins, mast cell stabilizers. You've got to whack-a-mole that to get anywhere because they just sort of react. And then
Mhm.
you've got to calm down the amygdala, which is also reacting. Their fear-based response, their lack of trust. They just don't trust themselves. They don't trust their bodies. They don't trust the medical system because it's failed them. They got medical PTSD most of the time.
Yeah, so
They've gone
often.
to the ER and said, I've got this. And they say, no, it's all in your head. Take a SSRI.
Yeah,
It's ubiquitous everywhere.
very very sad. Yeah.
Really sad.
I'm curious, Dr. Hoffman, just with the Benadryl, like Benadryl is one of my best friends when it comes to working with mast cell stabilization, and I recommend that quite liberally. But I'm just not familiar with IV Benadryl, and I'm just wondering if you wouldn't mind speaking to, like, is that just quite a bit faster acting or more effective when the oral form doesn't work, or is it because there's no preservatives in that one, or versus like all the red dyes and everything in the normal Benadryl? What's the advantage of the IV?
Well, the oral mast cell stabilizers all need to be compounded. You can't go and get them off the shelf because of
Sure.
all the excipients, they just react.
Hmm.
Benadryl, you can get a children's form of Benadryl, which is relatively dye-free. But if you really have a very reactive person, you've got to get all the mast cell stabilizers made up in liquid, in water,
Hmm.
sterile water.
Hmm.
And that only has a half-life of 2 weeks. So they got to constantly buy them.
Right, right.
So so what we do, because because there's so many mast cells in the gut, just taking mast cell stabilizers they sometimes can't tolerate them. The one that everybody sort of freaks out about is sodium chromoglycate or cromolin. So sometimes the oral introduction of mast cell stabilizers leads to more problems. So we just go straight IV, which bypasses the gut mucosa. So Benadryl is a short-acting H1 blocker.
Hmm.
So I don't use Benadryl. I use ketotifen as my first generation mast cell stabilizer. I use Benadryl as a rescue remedy in an acute episode, but I use ketotifen at night as a mast cell stabilizer and antihistamine. And we do IV Benadryl when we're trying to stabilize somebody who's just overreactive all the time. And they come in, get IV Benadryl and Ativan. Everybody freaks out, oh, benzodiazepines. And then you got the Ashton protocol where everybody says it took me 5 years to get off benzos.
Hmm.
When we use it acutely in low doses and stabilize the amygdala fear-based response and use Benadryl, we can then get the person to come in with their new food, their new supplement, take it. So we get them sitting in the chair, we get them self-regulating with the inner balance heart math device or any other device we use. And then we do the IV Benadryl, IV Ativan. Then they try the new supplement, they try the new food, sitting here, self-regulating with mast cell blockade. And then we see the outcome. And we do that over time, months, weeks to months. So we have people moving to Calgary for 6 months to a year.
Wow.
They have to be continuous care. Yeah. It's like a mini ICU for mast cell people. Yeah.
It sounds like it. That's a huge undertaking, but yeah,
Yeah.
those folks are oftentimes really desperate and just they need some
It's,
intervention.
they're very unstable and very fearful and very reactive. And their lives have fallen apart, and their support systems are under stress. It's a very real entity, and they get told that it's all in their head and it's just tragic sometimes.
Mhm. Yeah, I concur.
Yeah.
Um, Dr. Hoffman, one thing I was hoping to chat with you about as well, that you've mentioned it already here amongst the many things you mentioned in terms of the interventions. You leave no stone unturned, to say the least. Just around neurofeedback, about 3 months ago or so, we brought brain mapping and neurofeedback into our clinic, which we're really excited about. And I was just curious if you wouldn't mind just sharing which system you're using, and just maybe speaking to some of the benefits of brain mapping and neurofeedback that you've seen.
Yeah, I can hardly work. I mean, I don't know if I ever had to do without it. I don't know how it'd work. I really don't.
Wow.
So when we have a brain treatment center, and so we do heart rate variability. We're looking at the sympathetic, parasympathetic state. We do a stress assessment, which is it's sort of a biofeedback stress assessment, looking at different parameters of how the body reacts to mental stress in terms of respiratory rate, muscle tension, sweat response, etc. So that's number two. We then do MOCA for cognitive insight. We do a CNS vital sign for executive functioning, and we do a TOVA for concentration. Then we do a CAP, we do a QEEG, and we look at the different brain waves, delta, theta, alpha, and beta brain waves. And we do it eyes open, eyes closed, and we do a Loretta assessment where we're looking at deeper structures. And from that, you try and interpret the biography. You can actually read the biography of a patient off those parameters. You can actually tell the inner state from that often. And people with head injuries and attention deficit, they're going to have very high theta brainwaves, slowed brainwaves.
Mhm.
People with high beta are going to be anxious and have a lot of trauma often. Many often they have low alpha, so their capacity to regulate high beta is very depleted. So they need alpha stimulation and beta reduction and theta reduction. So we do 20 sessions of neurobiofeedback. We use BrainMaster software,
Mhm.
um, and that's the self-regulation piece. We often do remote training with Mind Lift, Brain Tap, Resimax. We do a lot of the safe and sound protocols from Porges for
Mhm.
those with high trauma.
Mhm.
We just do different protocols for different needs. And again, assessing the needs of the individual, the capacity to afford it, the capacity to do it, the resilience of the patient, the resources. Some people are just too exhausted, they can't do much. And so we have to titrate it according to the capacity to do it. Yeah. We try our best anyway.
As you said, it's an art form.
It's yeah, constantly change. You can't be dogmatic.
Mhm.
You can't be too self-righteously. Um, there's certain things that happen as you get more experience as a practitioner. Your gratitude and love for the patients grow. You don't see them as all sick. You see the healthy parts of themselves, but you do get a certain certainty about certain things. And it's not a dogmatic patriarchal imposition of certainty. It's just a certainty. It's just like, if you don't self-regulate, it's no use coming back to me. If you don't treat your POTS in this way and submit your 10-minute lean NASA test to me before I get on the line call with you, it's not worth you doing the call. That's not arrogant patriarchy. That's just certainty. And I think that's a cardinal pillar of healing. Now you've got to be ready to step back from that when they come and say, oh, well, my child was in hospital, I couldn't do it. Okay, fine.
Mhm.
So forth and so on. But you try and put down certain parameters to stabilize the system. And if you don't build a hierarchy of stability from the bottom up and the top down, you can't really intervene in that system. You've got to establish certain criteria for progress and be certain of it, but be ready to change. You've got to be flexible and certain at the same time.
So quite the dichotomy, and yeah, it's good to not be rigid, to say the least. Maybe circling back to the POTS, actually, which you kind of mentioned with just the example there with the lean test and everything. I'm just wondering, when you have a patient with POTS, are you primarily relying on pharmaceuticals to help regulate those symptoms, or are there
Yeah,
non-pharmaceutical things that are helpful?
hierarchy again. Salt, 2 teaspoons a day, 3 liters of water on average, but we do the bioimpedance looking at their fluid content, their inner and outer state, and their cell, this phase angle. We look at their muscle mass to look for protein intake.
Mm-hmm.
So generally speaking, 2 to 3 liters of water every day, 2 teaspoons of salt every day, salt sticks, electrolytes, stockings, 25 to 30 millimeters of mercury pressure, licorice root extract, adrenal cortical extracts. First, that's the first line. If that doesn't work, we jump to midodrine, fluorinep, and then we start stepping it up accordingly. And if there's no progress, then I get a cardiology consult and we look for ejection fraction, and then we go to more cardiac stimulants. Oh, by the way, I don't shy away from using stimulants like Adderall and Vyvanse when there's high theta brainwaves and high POTS, because they do help with POTS and they do help with motivation and inspiration and dopamine upregulation. So, a lot of people, I don't want to use pharmaceuticals. They distrust them. I use Ativan. I use Adderall. I use quercetin. I use salt. Anything that works is good enough for me.
Mm-hmm. That's a
I
good
don't
point.
I don't draw distinctions. I don't, I'll just use natural. A lot of the people who just want natural get into trouble because the natural can't help them.
In some cases, yeah, you want the best of all worlds, I think, is the way to go.
Whatever is needed, yeah.
Yeah.
That's the beauty of being an MD trained in functional medicine. I can go back and forth and negotiate with the patient. And there's some people, like I've had many vegetarian patients who've been vegan for philosophical reasons for 20 years. And I say, I understand and totally sympathize. I was the president of the Vegetarian Society for 10 years. I'm now a carnivore. I said I had to change my belief system in order to get the health that I needed to get in order to downregulate inflammation. And they'll go, no, 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 no. There's no way in hell. I said, okay, I'm just putting it into your system as a possible intervention. Yesterday, I was speaking to a patient who I hadn't seen for 6 months, who was a hardcore vegetarian on philosophical reasons, fully sympathetic. I didn't say don't change. I said, it's so hard to treat you. I asked her how she doing. I said, how's the vegetarian diet? She said, I'm fully carnivore now. I said, what are you talking about? She said, you were hardcore. You were never going to change that. There's one thing you would never change. What are you talking about? I said, no, I changed it. I'm feeling so much better.
That's great.
And I'm not against vegetarian diet as a short-term intervention, but generally I don't find it sustainable for when people are in cell danger response and nutrient depleted. It's very hard to repeat. I find as a lifestyle if you're resilient and healthy in the health cycle, but not when you're in the inflammatory cycle of the cell danger response. I don't think we can pull many people out of that just on vegetables and grains.
Yeah, I've found the same thing as a rule. There's exceptions, of course, but yeah, generally meat seems to be really helpful. And I know me personally, I went carnivore for a few months a couple of years ago. I'm still very much meat based, and I feel better eating that way. I've dabbled in like, oh, I'll just try eating more veggies again. It's like my body just doesn't want it. It really likes the meat.
It's so subtle, and all the Ayurvedic doshas make a difference as to what you can tolerate and not. You've got to know all your diets back to front. You've got to know paleo, autoimmune, low histamine, low oxalate, low salicylate, low glycemic. You've got to know all the variations because people are all over the place with what they need. And sometimes if you can't stay one step ahead, and all the tests they only help you with a couple of parameters, They're not going to tell you about salicylates. They're not, although one of them does. But you've got to sort of know clinically which diets are most advantageous. But generally, most people need a higher fat diet, generally. And higher fat meaning all the fats, not just threes. Everybody wants to take fish oil. Always taking people off fish oil. because we measure their fish oil, the omega-3s, and they're always through the roof, and their omega-6s are suppressed. And you need the omega-6, the linoleic, to provide the one tail of the phospholipid molecule, the phosphatidylcholine molecule, which creates the outer membrane, and then the phosphatidylethylalamine, which is the inner membrane on which the oxidative phosphorylation and ATP is produced.
Mm-hmm.
So you've got to know your fats, and you've got to use fats therapeutically. You've got to know them backwards, and you'll get the right fats.
Mm-hmm. Actually, on that note, Dr. Hoffman, if you don't mind my asking, I had a session with Justine, kind of like introducing me to the Body Bio products and the test profile that they offer through their clinic or through their company in terms of their interpretation. And I'm just wondering, based on your clinical experience, is it if say there was a patient who said, I really don't want to spend the money on the Body Bio testing profile, just want to take the the Body Bio PC, for example, just take that, maybe take some more omega-6s, is there, would you say that it's like it's overwhelmingly better to do the labs and get the specific numbers, or can you kind of just feel it out through like, oh, I'm going to put you on the things that people usually need, like the phospholipids, the omega-6s, and would that help 80% of people? Maybe they don't need to necessarily do the test. I'm just wondering what your experience has been with that.
So, Brian, I've stopped doing that. I stopped just guessing and hoping for the best. I just won't do that. It stresses me out. I don't know.
Fair enough.
It's
Fair
like,
enough.
so you do this and that happens, and I need a roadmap.
Mm.
So the greatest criticism I get is, oh, you cost so much. I don't cost so much. Your labs that I need in order to interpret your biochemistry cost a lot, but that's your fate. I'm just helping you. I need to measure, because if somebody comes in with arachidonic acid of minus 170 and a lipid profile of minus 225, that person's not recovering until you've repleted their lipids, which takes 4 to 6 months at best.
Mm.
So you need to measure those things. You can't guess them.
Mm-hmm.
I don't guess anymore. I won't work like that. It's too stressful.
Mm-hmm.
You've got to measure to manage. It's old cliche. It's true.
Okay.
And you need a lot of tests. I do at least 12 to 15 baseline. Food, gut, nutrients, fats, mitochondria, autoimmune markers, brain autoimmune markers. And if I need to, Lyme workup through, I use not just Almond Lab, T cell, ELISpots. I won't do that. I will need IGeneX antibody testing, both.
Mm-hmm.
And mold. Everybody comes in with a mold mycotoxin test. I got mold illness because I've got, ochratoxins in my urine. No, you don't. Do you fulfill the criteria for mold illness based on Shoemaker's original? You've got to fulfill exposure. You've got to fulfill the cytokine testing. You've got to be positive on the questionnaire. You've got to fail the VCR test. You can't just do a urine mycotoxin test and say, I've got mold. That's folly.
Mm. As far as the mitochondrial testing goes, just you mentioned that kind of in the list of tests there. What's your go-to mito test, if you don't mind sharing?
IGL, Germany.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
I can't work without it. Like I can't work without a QEG. I can't work without IGL.
Wow. Yeah.
It's the basis for everything I do. The IGL has given me the capacity to clinically work with Robert Naveau's research.
Mm-hmm.
It's the clinical application of Robert Naveau's work.
Mm-hmm.
It's got like 300 parameters and algorithms of what you need to do.
Great. Is he affiliated with that lab, or is it just a happy coincidence?
I don't know. And I asked Justine the other day, she said, do you know if Robert knows about IGL? She said she doesn't know. I don't know if he does.
Hmm.
And I don't know if he'd even approve of the test, but I do know from clinical experience that when that test gets better, the patient's better.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, when you see the cell membrane repair, when you see the voltage repair, when you see the glutathione go up, when you see phospholipids increase, when you see cardiolipin increase, when you see the toxic load go down, when you see mitochondrial numbers from autophagy go up, that person's better.
Mm-hmm. That's great.
Yeah. So I use it, test it, check it, treat it, 6 months later, repeat it.
Mm-hmm.
And that, along with the body biofatty acid profile, I do the prodrome plasmalogen. Some people come in with minus, like nothing. for plasmalogens, which are the intracellular production through the peroxisomes of the fats that are necessary to balance inflammation, and myelin.
Mm-hmm.
So I use those extensively.
Yeah.
And I can't do without them. And we have to turn people away because they can't. And it's a tragedy. I don't know how to solve the problem. I'm waiting for an angel investor to say, here's a $10 billion. Patients can come.
That sounds nice. If I hear of any, I'll pass them your way because it sounds like a good investment. Um,
Somebody out there is going to have an altruistic bent for integrative, holistic, functional medicine. I don't know.
that
There
would be
must be
nice.
somebody.
That would be nice.
Yeah.
Um, you'd also mentioned using adrenal gland extract for certain patients. I'm just wondering, do you have do you find that one brand or one kind of source seems to work better than others, or is it not really important where it's sourced from?
I use OrthoAdapt
Hmm.
because it's got the licorices, they've got the ginseng. Now, the ashwagandha in there, you got to watch out because they can raise liver enzymes on 1 out of 50 people.
Really, that frequent, eh? Wow.
Yeah, yeah. And licorice can raise blood pressure. So, but I do like it. I go to hydrocortisone if I need to. If I do this ZRT saliva 4-point profile,
Hmm.
and I do serum cortisol and ACTH, and they're in the tank, and I do the 24-hour cortisols and they low, I use hydrocortisone liberally, 10 milligrams morning, 5 at noon, or OrthoAdapt. But I try to do OrthoAdapt more than I use hydrocortisone.
Hmm.
And of course, you got to fix the thyroid. And the thyroid therapeutics are highly problematic. You get a TSH of 4, and people say, "Oh, you go to their GP." They say, "Oh, that's perfect." No, it's not.
Mm.
And they won't do T3, T4, and they won't do reverse T3, and
Hmm.
they don't do thyroid antibodies. If you don't do the whole spectrum of thyroid, and you don't test appropriately, you get into all kinds of pickles.
Hmm.
Because thyroid drives the heat that drives the Krebs cycle. If you increase the heat of a person's inner metabolism by 1 degree, the enzymes that drive the Krebs cycle go up 6 times in efficiency and speed. So your ATP production speeds up. Thyroid's huge. Thyroid's the most important hormone of all.
Yeah, absolutely. Um, as
But you
far
can't
as
drive a thyroid if the adrenals are collapsed because then you crash a patient. So it's thyroid, adrenal first,
yeah,
then the sex hormones, and blah, blah.
yeah,
You know,
it's also interrelated. Um, as far
and
as
and and the phosphatidylcholine membrane has got the receptors for the hormones. If you've got no PC and no PE, there's
yeah,
nowhere for those hormones to dock. So you can push them all you like, but they're not going to get into the cell to turn on the biochemistry of the cell.
absolutely, yeah. Um, just as we're kind of winding down on our time here, Dr. Hoffman, I was just wondering, and I'm kind of excited and nervous to ask you this question. So I'm just wondering, just where I think you mentioned, I think it was during the recording how you've done like 300 courses or conferences, in the last 15 years or something like that. I'm just wondering what's on your radar right now for like kind of new frontiers that you're excited about. What are you kind of like? What's recently in the last few months kind of come across your desk or your computer that's kind of got you excited or interested?
Well, that's a difficult question because I've got different layers and levels. I only think in layers and levels. I've got a one-track mind.
Hmm.
So at level 2, I do the TFIM conference all the time.
Yeah, it's a great one.
I do the ICAI conference.
Yep.
Uh, I'm not going to the environmental medicine conference. IFM, I haven't gone to for a while. A4M, I haven't gone to for a while. I
Hmm.
just pick and choose where I want to look at biochemistry. Oh, I
Hmm.
do a lot of the peptide for seeds conferences too.
Hmm.
And I'm trying to just, because we can't do stem cells in Canada. I'm having to learn stem cells by going down to Mexico and learning stem cell
Oh,
exosomes.
okay.
Yeah. So that's level 2. But my real love is art and alchemy,
Very
level
nice.
6. So
Yep.
I study art theory, art history, and I study alchemy and Jungian psychology. That's my true love.
Hmm.
The evolution of the inner cartography of the individual. Are they the outer union between male, female, and then the inner union between the internal masculine, feminine, and then the descent into the dark Negredo, and then the evolution into individuation over time. when you bring back the parts of yourself that you've left behind as you evolve into, hopefully, as complete a human being as you're meant to become, which is never complete, so, which is unfortunate. But it's a work in progress.
You never get bored, at least.
Alchemy is my great love. I love reading about alchemy.
Mm-hmm.
And how Jung, genius, just, he pioneered the correlation between the inner cartography of the soul and alchemy, and he put it together. And just, I don't know how, and there was no internet.
Yeah, no kidding.
No internet. He just
Yeah.
got books from all the great book dealers, and he sat and he read and he smoked his pipe and he put it together and he saw patients.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's amazing. Yep. Standing on the shoulders of giants. It's a beautiful thing.
He was a genius. He is one of the He's one of the greats.
Mm-hmm.
I think Robert Naveau is going to turn out to be one of the greats too.
I don't doubt it.
Yeah.
Um, well, Dr. Hoffman, thank you so much for taking the time to chat with me today. Just before we
Pleasure.
wind down our conversation, would you mind just sharing with what I know we spoke? I was going to ask you to share with listeners how they can access you and whatnot. I know you before we started recording, you mentioned you don't really have all that committed to memory, so I got to. Oh, go ahead. Sorry.
No, my staff will send. My website is
Mm-hmm.
hoppencenters.com,
Mm-hmm.
and the rest I don't know. But my staff will send you the details. They have it on a they have it on the slide.
Perfect. Well, I will. I'll post, as I said earlier, I'll post that all in the show notes. And if you're folks watching this on YouTube, it'll be in the comment section below. So just our video description below, I should say. So we'll post that information. And also for any non-Canadians or non folks not from the UK listening, Center is spelled the Canadian way, RE, not ER for Center. So for hoffmancenter.com. But Dr. Hoffman, before we wrap up, was there anything else that you wanted to share? Oh, please go ahead.
Yeah, there's just one thing. If people inspired by that sort of model I use, if you go onto my website and scroll down, there's a video ICEAI lecture I did a few years ago, and I go into more detail on the 7 levels, hour and a half PowerPoint where it's all set out if they're interested. And if
Wonderful.
they're truly interested, they go on my website, and there's a 6-hour course that I did. But the 1.5-hour lecture is a concise summary of that model I use.
Wonderful. Great. Yeah. Well, thank you so much for your time today, Dr. Hoffman. I really appreciate all of your wisdom. I really appreciate the approach that you take with your patients. Very, very inspirational. And I really thank you for your time today.
No, thanks, Brian. I look forward to, I just looked at your website and I saw, oh, that's everything I do. That's everything I do. That's everything. I'm going to look at your website and see what you're up to. So thanks, Brian. Thanks for the interview.
My pleasure. Thanks so much, everyone, for your attention today. I hope you enjoyed this episode of the Overcoming Chronic Illness podcast, and we'll leave it there. And please stay tuned for the next one.
See you.